Making sure I didn't forget anybody. I don't think I did. Well, hello, everyone. Good morning. Good morning. Thank you for coming.
We're on what, verse 34, I think?
No, it's
Of
just
chapter 22.
yes, we are. Look at you. The greatest commandment is our next. That's a good way to lead in. Who doesn't want to read about that?
Right.
We feel empty on this side of the table. I was thinking it's because Jackie and her family are back in school.
Oh, yeah.
So,
And Barb used to come.
yeah.
Too, but
Well, we are grateful for everyone who is here. Let's see.
Where are we again, please?
Yeah, we are in chapter 22. We didn't get very far without you, Dawn.
Okay.
Chapter
That's
20,
okay.
chapter 22, and we didn't get through the whole chapter because we like to chat. So we're at verse 34.
No, really?
We do. We have a lot to discuss. These are not easy concepts. Yeah. Should we? I'm torn whether we finish the chapter or whether we just take those 6 verses so we can talk about the commandment. Let's just finish it because the greatest commandment will kind of stick out.
Sure.
Would anyone like to read 34 through the end of 22?
Sure.
Great, thank you.
When the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, they assembled in a body, and one of them, a lawyer, in an attempt to trip him up, asked him, "Teacher, which commandment of the law is the greatest?" Jesus said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with your whole heart and your whole soul and your whole mind. This is the greatest and first commandment. The second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these 2 commandments, the whole law is based, and the prophets as well." In turn, Jesus put a question to the assembled Pharisees. "What is your opinion about the Messiah? Whose son is he?" "David's," they answered. He said to them, "Then how is it that David, under the Spirit's influence, calls him Lord, as he does? The Lord said to my Lord, 'Sit at my right hand until I humble your enemies beneath your feet.' If David calls him Lord, how can he be his son?" No one could give him an answer. Therefore, no one dared, from that day on, to ask him any questions.
Wow.
they've been slapped down one too many times.
Yeah.
Well, they had more than met their match. That was it.
They had met their match. While we all ponder, I'm just going to unplug this dehumidifier.
Boy, it really did come down.
I know.
Sorry, that was loud. So I spent a few years going to a Unitarian Universalist church.
Mm-hmm.
And the minister described himself as a humanist. He was not a theist. It was a church with a minister who didn't believe in a God, which was an interesting place to be. But they, in the sort of fundamental tenet, if you felt like you could belong there or not, was that all human beings deserve to be treated with respect. And sort of everything there flowed. It wasn't necessarily religious. People could be spiritual. There were a lot of physicists there. I was sort of not sure where I was, but I thought I can sign on to that. And I'm not sure, I mean, I'm not trying to compare that directly to this, but I'm not sure that that is all that much different than this second most important commandment. That if you can start with this idea of just loving other people, all of them, then it says let me read it. On this hangs all the law and all the prophets.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I just saw an interesting Dorothy Day quote the other day. And I'll have to paraphrase it because I don't remember it exactly. But she said that my love of God can never exceed my love for the least of his children.
Wow.
Or something like that.
Yeah.
In other words, it's kind of turning this same thing around, saying you can't say you love God if you're not loving
right
to other people.
Because if your love for God is the amount of love you have for the person you love the least,
right? Exactly.
It makes it hard. But I don't think that's inaccurate at all.
No, no, especially if
Always
you
be kind. Be, be kind. Treat people the way you want to be treated
yes.
until they show a different way. Give everybody respect
For
until they
me,
don't earn it anymore.
this is the heart of the gospel. Many times Jesus says that he doesn't come to do away with the law, but he comes to fulfill the law. And I think this is what he's speaking of here is the fulfillment of the law. Even if you look at the Ten Commandments carefully, it's all about loving God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And then the other commandments are about loving your neighbor as yourself. And what Jesus is saying when he says he's going to come to fulfill the commandments is, I think he's trying to make the point that it's not about living according to specific regulations, whether they be moral or cultic or whatever. Instead, it's about the law of love. Paul emphasizes this later in 1 Corinthians 13. But I think this is the center of the gospel. And I think a lot of people from other traditions, the tradition I came from, they get a little sidetracked when they try to define their religion or their Christianity by what they do or what they don't do, observance. I think it's going back to a kind of the view that the Pharisees had, that it's all about perfect compliance with the written and the oral law. But Jesus puts it on a whole new basis, a basis that's much, much, much harder to do than actually just fulfilling a list of requirements. Mm-hmm. When you think about loving God as with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and loving your neighbor as yourself, that's a pretty high standard.
Well, it seems to me like if Jesus is saying those are the two greatest laws, if you actually follow them the way he expects people to follow them, you wouldn't need any other rules.
Yeah,
it's true. And I think part of it boils down. Go ahead, David. I'm sorry.
I was just going to say quickly, at the heart of them, they can't be followed like laws. That's the point. You can't just meet the criteria. There's something that has to happen through the love of God and his grace and the Holy Spirit making this possible. It goes far beyond just living according to a list. It's so much harder and so much more effective. Yeah, absolutely, Carol. I agree.
Yes. I was just going to say it also has to do with the word love and how it is so often misinterpreted, or there are certain expectations wrapped around that word. You don't have to like a person. In fact, you could loathe a person and still love them in the way that Jesus is talking about. Extending them dignity and respect and treating them the way you want to be treated. Love, the word love conjures up, so many ideas, and it's it's unfortunate that we don't have a little bit more subtlety, more words to describe this thing that we call love, because but this is very much kind of an action word. It's like how you're actually going to behave towards other people, whether you like.
Yeah.
That's really good, Greg. In Greek, in Koine Greek, there are three words that are commonly used for love.
Mhm.
One is eros,
Right.
which is kind of the kind of love that we hear about in song and story all around us, which is physical attraction. It's
Right.
that kind of romantic love. Then there's phileo, which means brotherly love. It's the
Mhm.
brother that the kind of love that you share with people you have a lot in common with, your friends, your family. And then there is agape, which is a different kind of love, which indicates more of a, it's not a feeling, it's not an emotion. I think it's best defined as a choice
Correct.
that you choose to act towards people in certain ways. It's been defined a lot of ways, and there's overlap in these meanings. Just as a side comment, when I was in college, I one of the Bible classes I took was in Matthew, and I chose to take it, and it was a class where um, we translated Matthew from Greek into English. That was the thrust of that course. I chose
Mhm.
to do it because I wanted to be under that professor. But anyway, so that you take a look at all these different concepts, and this is really pointing to some important things right now. This greatest commandment right here. The next few chapters are going to really delineate this. They're going to line it all out, and it's going to climax at the end of chapter 25, which is going to give a clear definition of what God expects of of people. But I just think, as you say, love can be misunderstood too often. That love can be seen as an emotion, the way we feel about people. And it's not that. It's the way we choose to act towards people. And what I would like to think, as we choose to act towards people and we begin to develop empathy for them, people we formerly loathed, perhaps we begin to develop some sympathy for. But I think the kind of love we're talking about here, the agape love, is kind of like the fake it till you make it. Sometimes it's the way we choose. It's
Mhm.
this is all, any of us that have been married can attest to this too. When you start out loving someone, it's all about eros and you got the warm fuzzies. But if you stay together very long, you realize it has to be based on something more than that. It has to be based on a choice that you choose to be with that person and act for their welfare, even on days when you don't feel so warm and fuzzy, or even don't necessarily feel brotherly love, but you just choose to act for their
Or might
benefit.
not even like them at the time, but you still love them.
Right.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And there's another piece to this that I think is often overlooked. Love your neighbor as yourself.
Mhm.
That implies that you have to love yourself. And we are all strapped to one extent or another with degrees of uh, self loathing
Mhm.
You're
sometimes,
right. You're
but
absolutely right.
self doubt, the wounds and the traumas that we've experienced throughout various stages of our life. And the fact is, if you're a hot mess, it's really hard to love other people.
Mhm.
So, I mean, I think Jesus is talking about it's like a two-edged sword there. It's a dual responsibility. In order to love your neighbor as yourself, you have to love yourself. You have to do the work. You have to be reflective, and you have to try to undo some of the wrongs of the past, most of which were perpetrated on us. But, especially as children, it's so easy to believe lies and nastiness and all that adults perpetrate on children. And then it takes years to kind of parse that all out and overcome all that. Mm-hmm. So that's an important part of that I'm not sure how often that's preached upon.
I wonder if part of that is in the first part, because when I've thought about this a lot, and one of the things someone said to me that helped was that if you really love God with all your heart, in a way, I guess the way I thought it was, if you can understand the nature of God, then you would understand how like beautiful and precious you are and how much God loves you. And if you really understood the nature of God and how the creator of the universe has nothing but perfect unconditional love for you as one of his children, then it would be really difficult to not also love yourself. That there has to be that kind of understanding, and that if you understood how perfectly God loved you, then you'd understand perfectly he loved all of his children. And that helps then you treat other people with love. But if you don't have that first step, if you don't know that God is love and what that feels like, and for me, when I'm in a self-loathing bit, that's really distant. That is, you might as well be doing theoretical physics, because I'm not catching that at all.
Right.
And so the first part is being able to even see that in my mind. Someone explained it to me that way once. But I'm sorry, Carol, you're starting to say something.
In fact, what I was gonna say is kind of links of what you were saying, that you probably need to understand how much God loved you, and you need to love them, because to me, that there again, that's where the fine line of what does love mean, because there are a lot of people in the world that really love themselves and are terrible to everybody else. So, and they don't see that they need to treat everybody the way they want to be treated.
Yeah, like a narcissistic personality. Exactly. I wonder if that's love.
Isn't that the golden rule? Treat people like you want to be treated.
Right. Exactly.
Right.
Yeah. Right.
I think in Christianity, we struggle with lots of things. We struggle with the scars that our parents and the people around us have given to us. We struggle, a lot of us, with a theology that leaves significant scars. If you look at the creation story, and you look at it essentially as man rebelling against God, and because of that, God's gonna, we're totally depraved. So we're complete sinners, and we're worms. And if you view yourself that way, then it's because of the way you feel that God feels about you, and that's really going to shape. It's going to shape the way you think about everything. It's going to shape the way you think about yourself and other people. And I think the basis of self-love, of being able to understand who we are in God's eyes, who we are as God created us to be, is very important. And as Carol shared, we have to distinguish sometimes. For some of us, no, but for some of us, we have to distinguish between love of self and self-interest.
Right. Yes.
But yes, this is very important. As Greg says, both sides of this equation are important. We have to have the correct understanding of who we are in God's eyes, in order that we can love him correctly back, in order that we can love others, because otherwise the whole relationship between man and God is so messed up. It's just it's impossible to live out this kind of a love, I think.
Right. Yeah.
I was thinking about this idea that where all of the law hangs off of these commandments. And this might not, I don't know, I'm kind of thinking as I'm talking, but in law school, I took a class on wills and estates, and there's this whole body law called probate law. So if you die without a will and test it, then there's a bunch of rules about how all of your assets are divided. And as you're learning them, they said all of these rules are because we as a society are trying to do what we think that person would have wanted. And so all of the principles for how that's all divided, like I have a stepson. And so if my husband died without a will, it wouldn't go just to me, because they would assume the stepmom wouldn't necessarily provide for the other child. So there's what they call the wicked stepmother clause. And then there's all of these other, and it really gets complicated because it's all just different examples. It's like, well, what would you do here, court? And they decide, and then it builds for hundreds of years. But all of those rules are just, let's assume this person loves their family and wants to be fair. And I was just thinking about that, like this concept, like if we love God and each other, then all of these various complicated rules over thousands of years can be developed. But if we really know if the person's there and really just is actively loving the person and divides it. And I was just thinking about how so many rules and all this complexity can really come from something so simple. And you think about all of the commandments and all of the, I don't know, all the behavioral constraints that we try to say this is good and this is bad. And it's all just, if we just love each other, it should be natural.
Yeah, right.
But I don't know.
Right. But sometimes simplicity is the most difficult thing.
Right.
I mean, this is pretty simple. This boils it down to a pretty simple concept. But that doesn't
Treat
mean
others the way you want to be treated.
Yep.
The heck?
Yep.
Yeah.
But the problem comes in, and why the explication came about is that some people don't live according to this principle. And so we need written down regulations so that people can't take advantage of one another. If we all did live by this principle, it would make things considerably easier, but we don't all.
True.
Yeah.
Even in our best moments, we don't all. So the explication was necessary, at least to teach. That's what Paul talks about later, that the law is a taskmaster, a teacher, to teach people two things. One, how to get along with each other, and second, that this system ultimately doesn't achieve what God wants it to achieve, which is to love him and to love others. It's an attempt, but it doesn't quite get there. And God wants us to move on to the position of where we are gracious toward one another and we love one another. We choose to treat one another well because we understand that God has treated us so well and who we are in God's eyes.
And it comes in this whole section of people trying to sort of like give Jesus two tricky choices and do like a little gotcha and back him into all these sort of verbal and argumentative corners. And when they ask him, like, well, what's your rule? He responds with something. There's no wiggle room here. There's no, well, what's the definition of was, or whatever. It's like, this is simple, all encompassing, kind of a, I don't know. I think like just argumentatively, the way it's laid out, it's a very brilliant way to frame things.
Jesus goes beyond
reading the Message as well as the Children's Living Bible. Yeah, Jesus gets pretty testy sometimes.
Yeah, you missed all of his like.
Oh no, I didn't. I kept reading just because I wasn't here. Doesn't mean I wasn't reading.
Yeah, he's been kicking over tables, Don. I'm sorry, David.
Yeah, and not having a good time.
Nope.
Jesus goes beyond compliance to a list of rules, realizing that no list of rules can be effective enough, can be detailed enough to the fact that it's all about motive. It's all about what we're choosing to do. It's all about the heart, how we choose to treat others. It's not about seeing these laws and seeing and keeping them to the letter, but finding ways to get around them to our own advantage.
Actually, David, I've been introduced to Pentecostal religion. A woman that if I asked who Melchizedek was, and she gave me a whole list. It's interesting that other avenues are now opening up to me. Different paths, but they're all one truth.
There was a book, The Path is Made by Walking, that sometimes you don't know the path you're on, but you start walking and the path is made by walking. And then there's lots of things sort of appear as you need them.
Right.
But I'm glad you're on a path, Don.
It's interesting. It's a learning experience. I've got the Message as well as the Children's Living Bible sitting here open.
Well, I'm glad we can be part of your path today.
I am blessed.
We are happy to have you with us. We have time. We could
Sure.
even start
Let's do
another chapter. Would anyone like to read? Oops, there go my glasses. Oh,
We didn't talk about the next section though.
oh yeah,
about
you're right.
David.
Nope, let's
About
not.
David.
Let's not shirk David. I'm sorry.
Yeah, David and his son. I mean, I'm not sure too much about it myself. It's a little confusing when you're calling it when David calls. Well, anyway, when Jesus calls, I don't. What was this? I don't know.
Jesus is setting a verbal trap for him, and he's saying in their culture, the fathers didn't refer to their sons as Lord.
Right.
And Jesus is a descendant of David. So technically, according to that understanding, Jesus should refer to David as Lord. But in this particular scripture, that they're taking, Jesus is applying a messianic kind of application to it and saying, well, how can David possibly be calling one of his offsprings Lord? That just doesn't make sense. So, and he's trying to get them to, how do you explain this? And they didn't have an explanation. Yeah.
Well, do you think that they're looking at the Messiah as being their physical, like we talked about in the past? He's their physical Messiah. He's gonna, save them from oppression and slavery, rather than their spiritual Messiah and open the gates of heaven to them, rather than, free them from the Roman slavery that they're under. To me, because with Jesus saying this about David wouldn't call him Lord, what he's doing is putting David on an even level with all the rest of us. We're just all children of God.
And David was the kind of Messiah they were looking for.
Correct.
Right.
David was a military leader who helped protect the kingdom, God's people at that time. And that's the kind of Messiah they were looking for. They were not looking for an Isaiah kind of suffering servant, which is the way that after Jesus' death and resurrection, people began to look at the Messiah. Christians, people that followed Jesus, they viewed that kind of Messiah as a suffering servant. But that was not the understanding at the time, as you're saying, Carol. They totally misunderstood what the role of Messiah as Jesus' Messiah turned out to be.
David, was King David ever proclaimed as Messiah? And if not, why not? He was obviously the kind of leader that this whole messianic story referred to. So if he was not at his time referred to as Messiah, why would that have not been?
Well, he was a Messiah, literally means anointed one.
Okay.
And in that sense, David was the anointed of God. But the understanding of Messiah as we view it from the Jews is specifically referring to Jews in the Second Temple period, when they came back, and the fact that they were still under Roman occupation. And they were looking for someone in the spirit of David to come, to be an anointed one, to lead them into political autonomy. So it wasn't the term specifically they referred to the king at the time of David. This was an understanding that developed in the Second Temple period, the period after the exile, but they were still all the time. They weren't autonomous. They were under the heel of Rome. They weren't able to rule themselves. So they're looking to someone to bring them that political freedom. And that's what the Messiah, as as they understood it in Jesus' time, referred to. And of course,
So,
Jesus, when he put another spin on it, by freeing them in a different way, by creating a completely different kingdom, one based on suffering service rather than on political victory and power and authority. So, yeah, does that answer the question? At least give you a beginnings of an answer, Greg?
sure. I have a tag on question then. When you're talking about the exile, you're talking about when the Hebrews were in Babylon, when Babylon conquered them and they were, or which exile are we talking about?
The second, there were two exiles. There, it was the second exile specifically, and after that, they came back. But after that, then again, they were reconquered by Rome, and so they were currently under Roman occupation.
Sure.
And so,
How many years transpired between when they were able to come back to Jerusalem from Babylon and then when the Romans conquered Israel?
I
Was
don't
there a
know. I'd have to look that up. It's sometime in the five. It's sometime around the second exile was sometime around 536 or something BC. And
oh,
to be honest, I'm not sure exactly the time. It was about the time of Alexander the Great, where they split up, and then they split up between his two sons, and then that was later conquered by Rome. And I don't know the exact date of that. So, but it was sometime. It was the second. It was within 100.
They
Yeah, it
were,
was
if
several
we're
hundred
talking
years.
about Alexander the Great, they had a thing on History Channel this weekend about him, and he was like 356 BC.
correct. Yes. Yes, he
I can
was.
look. I can look it up real quick to see when Rome conquered. When Rome conquered Palestine. I don't know specifically. That was about the time of Julius Caesar. I think.
Yeah. When they came back from their exile from Babylon, who lived in Israel? Who did they have to conquer to get back Israel?
They didn't. There were Samaritans that were living there. Not all the people left. Some of them stayed, and that was one of the contentions between some Samaritans and
Um,
the returning people, was that they viewed them kind of as like mixed race, and certainly kind of like the French, some of the French in the World War II, that what do they call the Vichy's, that conspired or went along with the Nazis at the time.
Right,
So
right.
I'll just look real quick to see when Rome conquered Rome.
See, then that brings up another whole set, and we've kind of talked about this some in the past also. If the returning Hebrews then had to conquer the Samaritans, it's like, why do the Hebrews get to be oppressors? And then why are they such victims when they are the oppressed?
They,
You know,
I don't think they had to conquer the Samaritans. They came back, and the Samaritans. It wasn't. They never had a war with the Samaritans. They were just there. And the Hebrews, when they returned under the authority of the king at that time, and they were there wasn't a battle. It was internecine warfare between their cousins and them, based on the religion was different, and the fact that the returning Hebrews kind of looked at the Samaritans as people who had conspired and intermarried with the people of the land at that time. The Romans conquered Palestine in 63 BC.
okay.
Was that with Julius Caesar?
Oh, I don't remember. I didn't look that far. Let me see who did that. I'm not sure who.
There's a timeline in my Bible, and it
Oh,
says Alexander 336 was when Alexander the Great defeats Persians and occupies the Levant and Egypt. Then Rome gains control over Greece in 188 to 146.
But
And then they said so the Roman, then Julius Caesar's was named dictator, and he and anyway that they were talking about 63.
And that's when they conquered Palestine.
yes.
Okay. Okay.
So there was some time between the exile and the being reconquered by Rome, but at the same time they were still part of the empire of Alexander the Great, who had divided it up into two different sections. Yeah. So yeah. So Israel, they were they were a very small country in a very politically violent and tumultuous place. They were just getting kicked around the whole time. And but here they are under the heel of Rome, and they're looking for someone to put them back on top. And they're thinking back to the good old days when David led us to victory over the Philistines. And so there's all this feeling, and that's what they want. They wanted this political leader. And this feeling, even after Jesus continued to the point that they were so defiant that basically in 70 AD, Rome said, "We've had enough." They came in, they leveled Jerusalem, they destroyed the temple, and basically that just ended the Hebrew religion as it had been at that time with the sacrificial system. They had to develop a whole new way of thinking. They were destroyed, and the nation of Israel was no more. So they all became part of what was called the dispersion, the diaspora, and that's when they developed the synagogue system and everything that they currently have today. Because the temple was gone, they couldn't sacrifice. Their whole religion had been completely, basically destroyed in the way we understood it.
Right. That's one of the interesting paradoxes about the Roman Empire, though. There is that term, the Pax Romana, which refers to the fact that when Rome went in and conquered, yes, nobody wants to be a conquered people, but it did bring peace of sorts to this warlike area that just had, hundreds and hundreds of years of one kingdom, killing off another and all that. So, I think that was a lot of the tension that was going on while Jesus was alive, was the fact that there was such a tenuous peace. The Hebrews were allowed to keep their king and to keep their religion and all that, and all they had to do was just kind of abide by the rules and the laws and all that. So there was actually a good side of Rome, even though oftentimes Rome used cruelty and excessive punishment, warlike punishment. But those nations, there was Assyria, there was Persia, there was Babylon. Those countries were always tooth and nail killing each other off, including Israel.
And Egypt and
those Philistines were no joke.
no.
Roman, the Pax Romana was real if you were willing to submit in a couple ways, and the Hebrews were not willing. They had to pay taxes, and they basically had to recognize the Caesar, the Roman emperor, as God. Right. And the Hebrew, and they were absolutely unwilling to do that. And not only were they unwilling to do that, but they kept trying to overthrow Rome. They kept having groups within the zealots that were trying to overthrow the Roman government militarily. They had people claiming to be messiahs. And if you went too far, the one thing Rome was not going to put up was rebellion and riots and things like that. And when they went too far, they had enough. They just said nope, and they just squashed them.
Yeah.
Yep.
That was an interesting comparison between the empire of Alexander and the empire of Rome, because Alexander basically would go in, conquer, and then local people were appointed as governors. Their people were able to keep their own gods and their own this and that. And in fact, Alexander kind of made it a habit of adopting some of their cultural things.
Well, he married a lot of the people he conquered too, for blood ties.
Yes.
I mean, he had several.
Rome was the same way, Greg. They didn't care that the Jews worshiped their own God. That's all fine. They let them do that. And they've appointed local people, but they just insisted that they also recognize the authority of Rome and the authority of the Roman emperor, that he was a god as well. And that's the step Israel, they just wouldn't do that. Both they considered it idolatry, and also they were just stiff-necked, stubborn people. They didn't want to be ruled.
Yeah,
and
one has to wonder how many Roman citizens actually believe, oh yeah, this guy is God. You know, it might have had just more to do with, kind of kowtowing to the unmistakable authority and just kind of
not want to stick your neck out. It kind of puts last week's render unto Caesar what is Caesar's in perspective to this conversation. This idea where Jesus was like, there's huge geopolitical things we're talking about.
Yes.
And he was sort of like, well, if this coin has his face on it, I don't care if he takes it.
Yeah.
Like he sort of just puts all of that, he minimizes it so much. Like, you see this coin, his face is on it. We'll give it back to him.
Right.
It doesn't have anything to do with love. It doesn't have anything to do with anything I'm talking about. And to put all of that discussion into such like an aside, like, I don't care what you do with this coin.
Yeah.
It's sort of brilliant. The more you put it in context, the more brilliant it appears to me.
Yeah. And I realized that probably the vast bulk of the taxes that were exacted on all of Rome's little kingdoms were to support the military. I mean, Rome had such a huge military machine. It takes a lot of money to do that. But you also have to remember that Rome built roads, built aqueducts, did all kinds of things to improve the quality of life in the areas of these people who are paying taxes. Isn't it funny? We're still arguing about taxes. People who start ranting about taxes, I feel like saying to them, what do you want to give up? Your ambulances, your libraries, your schools?
Yep. Yes. The answer is yes.
The taxes that were assessed were not assessed. They didn't come directly from Rome. They came from the Rome divided their authority up. They had Caesar, and then they had the people who were governors and stuff like. They were assessed by the governors, and frankly, the taxes were used to enrich the governors, the governors and the military leaders and things like that, as well as the tax collectors.
Yeah.
So it was a different system than we have a little bit, but it kind of functioned the same way that the people on top seem to get the most of it. But anyway, that's a separate issue we could get into. Yeah, so it's
the trains run on time.
Yeah.
I mean, it's mostly, we have the same argument all the time.
Yeah. Trash building up on your curb.
But
yeah.
Well, we did not get to 23, which is fine. We're not in any big hurry. We will start with 23 next week. And thank you all for being here. If you have the used version of the climate book,
I do.
Yes.
You are missing a chapter. So either let me or Terry know and we can help you.
Do you not have any more of them?
All right. So anything before we say goodbye?
Was there an announcement made formally that we're hoping to read the foreword in chapter 1? Any of these folks who are involved in Adult Forum?
Forward in chapter 1 for Sunday. If you need anything, just let me know. And Terry Tucci is volunteered to sort of
be the moderator.
I was going to say mediate, but I want to say moderate. All right.
Yeah.
We ordered the book, but we don't have it yet.
Okay.
Session leader.
See y'all on Sunday.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye-bye.
God bless. Bye-bye.